Welcome to Direction Northeast. Hello, I'm Laura LaRue. This program is a presentation of the Mass Communications Department of Northeast State Community College. The book Perfect Timing focuses on the life of Isaac Murphy, a black jockey born in 1861 and the first sports celebrity in America. Author Patsi Trollinger, a native East Tennessean, talks about Murphy, children's literature, and the process of becoming a writer in just a moment on Direction Northeast.
Northeast State's a wonderful place to start your career in college, and the campus is beautiful. The teachers are one-on-one.
It was an excellent decision to come to Northeast State. I've learned so much coming here.
I love the school, and everyone is friendly here. This has been the best time of my life. I have really enjoyed being here.
I think if it hadn't have been for Northeast, then I wouldn't feel as happy and as driven if I chose another school.
Step by step, Northeast State is here to get you there. Enroll now at northeaststate.edu.
Our guest, Patsi Trollinger, loves the printed word. From an internship with the Kingsport Times-News to editing a magazine at Emory and Henry, Miss Trollinger pursued her writing career. Welcome to Patsi Trollinger.
Oh, thank you.
Now, Patsy, tell us about your passion for the written word.
Well, it's interesting. I think, and people from this area will understand this, it actually began with oral stories. That was the way our family entertained themselves. My father was particularly a great storyteller, preferred humor, often told stories about his own childhood, and that just mesmerized all of us. I have 3 sisters, and so we spent a lot of time talking and telling stories as we talked. My mother had a passion for history, and she was very interested in the written word. It was a great combination to have that kind of upbringing when storytelling was natural, a love of books was natural, and so we grew up caring about words and about the things that words could do.
When and how did you decide you were going to be an author?
Well, it's interesting. I had no notion when I was young that that was even a remote possibility. I meet people now, other authors, who knew from the time they were 4 or 5. One of my friends grew up next door to someone who's very famous in children's literature. She grew up next to Jean Fritz, and I'm jealous because this friend knew from that time on that it was possible to be an author and that she wanted to be one. That was not true for me. I took for granted the use of words. I knew I enjoyed it, but I honestly did not know that you could make a profession of that, and that sounds naive. But so I started, when I first began to think of careers, I thought of social work, counseling, and I did counseling for a while before I shifted into writing at Emory and Henry. So, and I still have those twin interests. And it took me a long time to realize that I really wanted to write a book. I started by writing news stories for the Kingsport Times-News. I was a correspondent from my high school. And then at Emory and Henry, I wrote news releases and magazine stories. So I was always using words to produce stories. But the idea of writing a book didn't occur to me until after we had left this region and moved somewhere else. And I'm still not sure how that mental process came about, but I think being uprooted had something to do with it. I missed this region a great deal. I missed the mountains. I missed the friends I had here. And there was a sense that something was missing in my life. And I can't fully explain why I started down this road, but it became very apparent to me that it was the next thing I wanted to do with my life.
Now, I understand you didn't major in storytelling. What did you major in at?
No, and in fact, it's interesting. My friends are appalled. I've never had a real writing class. I majored in political science at Emory and Henry, had a minor in English, but that was at a time when English was primarily devoted to literary criticism, which I'll just be honest, it didn't interest me. In fact, it was very troubling to me. And I know there's a place for literary criticism, but at that time, as a young person, I was very troubled that you could be in an English class and the intent was to take a story apart rather than to put it together. So I really enjoyed my political science major. I was all about saving the world. This was a long time ago. People laugh, but and in that major, I actually had to do a great deal of writing. Dr. Samir Saliba and Dr. Steve Fisher at Emory and Henry required us to write all the time. So we had to explain ourselves on paper. So I got that practice.
How did it feel when you first had your work published?
Well, it's interesting. The first sense of being published was in the magazine at Emory and Henry. Now, the news releases that I wrote were always appearing in some small paper because we wrote stories that local papers were interested in. But I rarely got a byline because it was considered like submitted material or wire service, or it wasn't wire service, but they treated it like that. It was just a piece of news and they ran it. So my first bylines were in the Emory and Henry magazine, and I admit it was a thrill. I liked that. I liked seeing my name on there. So it was very exciting. And then when the book finally came out, of course, that's just, it's very special. It was very different.
You talk about writing verses and making greeting cards as a child. How did this prepare you to become a writer later on in life?
Well, you know, at the most elementary level, when I look back on it, with a greeting card, you are intentionally, for like, you know, when I was 3rd grade and wanted to do a greeting card for my father, I had to think about audience, and I had to think about the reason I had taken a sheet of construction paper and a crayon, and then I had to think about what I wanted my audience to feel, and my father liked humor. And so my cards for him were often corny jokes. He loved jokes. So there were all these chicken crossing the road jokes and jokes about farm vegetables. And so I think I didn't know that at the time, but looking back I can see that even then there was a sense that you're doing this to communicate some feeling to someone or to produce a desired result. Just the same as your newscast, there's a plan. There's a reason for doing it, and the way you approach words has to do with what your audience and what your plan is. So.
Well, was it difficult getting your start and getting your first book published?
Oh my, we could spend your entire program talking about that, and I laugh about it now, and I tell people who are newer to the field that I'm the poster child for mistakes. I did it the old-fashioned way. I didn't have an agent, which meant I did years of research, years of writing and rewriting without knowing if the book would be published, began submitting it, and I had 31 rejection letters before I got any letter that said, and the encouraging letter I got said, we like this story, but we think it needs revision. Without any contract and any money, will you continue revising until we're satisfied? And it took another 1.5 years. My friends laugh when I tell them that I wrote it first as a picture book, which is pretty short, like 2,000 words. Then to try to please this editor, she thought she wanted something longer. I wrote 17,000 words. She said, that's too much, cut it in half. Cut it to 9,000. Then she said, try 7,000. And then the people who decide the contracts and the money said, well, we really want 2,000, but not the original 2,000. So I wrote it so many ways. So I'm kind of a poster child of everything that can go wrong, but that's okay. Everything was a learning experience.
So how long total did you spend on the process of making this book in particular?
It took from the first clipping until the day it was published was 11 years. From the first news clipping that got me started thinking about the topic until the day it was published was 11 years. It doesn't have to take that long. I didn't know what I was doing. And the research, a large part of that was doing research, and I've been able to use some of that research to let it spin off into other things. So it wasn't all wasted time.
If you could give any advice, what advice would you give to aspiring young writers?
The number one advice is to read, read, read. Because if you want to write well, then you need to know what the best people in your genre are doing. Like if you want to excel at newscasting, you probably watch some of the best in the business to learn from their techniques. It's the same with writing. Read books of the type that you admire, and then of course the next thing is to simply write. You just have to simply sit down and do it.
And now I understand you're active in the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators.
Right.
What can you tell our audience about that organization?
Well, it's one of the world's largest writing organizations, and it's devoted to trying to help people who want to write or produce art for children's books, helping them improve their skills and succeed in the field. And then once you have a book, they help you try to find ways to market it. And it's a really ingenious organization. It began with 62 members 40 years ago. It has a very small staff. It's run almost entirely by volunteers. It now has 22,000 members all over the world. The newest chapter is in Mongolia. So when we have like large conferences, it's fascinating. At the last meeting I attended, I sat by a woman from Egypt, which was just really interesting to me. So.
Now, you work a lot with children's literature. What qualities does it take to be a successful writer of children's books?
Ooh, that's a tough question. Clearly a good imagination, but I think the very hardest part, and the corollary of this is the most frequent mistake, is not keeping yourself in the mind of the child and what they're concerned about at a particular age as opposed to what we're concerned about as adults. And I've heard people explain that, like, picture books, like that book and this book, for a very young age, that at that age what their life is about is, I am discovering the world. And then middle grade novels that are more for like 4th, 5th, 6th graders, that the big theme in their life is, oh, I have discovered that the world is unfair. And then more teen novels that the theme is, oh, I have discovered that I can make my own decisions in the world, and sometimes I'm going to screw it up royally. So adults are concerned about taxes, being married, raising children, bosses. Kids are oblivious to those things. It's all about what their personal need is at that time.
Sounds like you've really studied this.
Yes.
What are the current trends in children's literature?
Well, anybody who reads a lot of children's lit will know that the huge thing lately, the category called young adult, or YA, which is for teens and older, that's been very hot, and that fantasy. And all I have to do is say the word Twilight, and people will know what I'm talking about. Harry Potter started that movement, but fantasy has been and is huge. Vampires, time travel, werewolves, all of that's huge. That may be declining, and middle grade novels for slightly younger, a lot of people are saying they're going to be the next big thing. But fantasy's still a very big deal, and a lot of, I don't know if political fantasy is the right word, but many people have read the Hunger Games trilogy, and some adults are appalled by it, but I've talked to a lot of kids in schools, and it speaks to a very discouraged outlook about where society is headed in terms of famine and war, and a lot of kids say, yeah, that's the way I see it. So they're very interested in reading fantasy that imagines what the world might be like when they are my age.
It's a very interesting perspective. Well, let's talk a little bit about your book, Perfect Timing. How did you learn about Isaac Murphy, and what attracted you to his history?
Well, it's interesting. At the time, I still had my job doing news for a college. At that point, I was working for Center College in Central Kentucky, and I had to read 7 newspapers every day, and I was always looking for quirky things. I had to find certain things for my job, but in the process, I would run across things. And one day, I saw a tiny article. It was 4 sentences long that said, essentially, Isaac Murphy ought to be famous. He was the first person to win the Kentucky Derby 3 times, but he has been virtually forgotten. A racetrack in Florida hopes to change this next week. They have named a race for him. That's all it said. And as I tell 4th graders when I'm in a school, that really bothered me, because if I had won the Derby 3 times, I'd want the whole world to know about me, and I would want someone to write a book. And I was like, oh, maybe I can write a book. And so I did research first to see if there was more information. Discovered there was a ton of information about him. There are 2 racing libraries in Kentucky where all the information in those libraries is about horses and racing. I found out actually there was way too much information about him, and then I began kind of slogging through the research. But it was that one little clipping, and it's funny now, partly because of my book, but partly because of some things that have happened at a museum in Kentucky. His name is a pretty big deal, at least in Kentucky. People know who he was.
It's amazing you were able to find that much research on somebody who was, alive and born in, the mid-1800s.
Well, racing in Central Kentucky, and of course when I moved there, that was the biggest difference from here. And again, this is something I tell kids in schools. I said, where I grew up, there were mountains and there was NASCAR. I moved to Kentucky, there's bluegrass, and there are horses and racing. And so I was fascinated by it because for me it was an unknown. So I was always watching racing information. But because racing is such a big deal, Kentucky has gone to extreme lengths to preserve racing history. And it's partly financial. I didn't understand this till I went to the library at Keeneland. Part of the reason the library exists at the Keeneland racetrack is for investors who want to invest in a racehorse, and they want to check its bloodlines. Not only, I'll use the term mother and father because the actual racing terms don't sound too good, but they want to know the ancestors of that horse going back, you know, sometimes 10 and 20 generations to decide if they're going to invest $1 million in this horse. So there were often, when I was at the library looking for photos and nuggets that kids might be interested in, often there were people there who were there for monetary reasons looking through these old newspapers. So Keeneland had a reason to keep all that information, and it is a treasure trove. Photos, newspapers, magazines, it's just unbelievable.
Well, what message does the story bring to today's audience?
Well, it's interesting. Teachers, because his life was so complicated, I'm fascinated that teachers can take this book and connect it with a lot of different curriculum. I've been to the Lee County, Virginia schools a number of times because I have a college friend who teaches there. She has used it for character education because Isaac was unusual for a jockey at that time. It was very unusual that he did not believe in swearing or gambling, and he refused to cheat. He was once offered a huge sum of money if he would simply come in second in a race, and he declined it, which was a promise to him before the race. He declined it, not knowing what he would do, and he won that race. So people were fascinated by his honesty. So there's character education, but then his story also, because he was born a slave, he survived the Civil War, and he and his mother were emancipated. And then they had to make a living, and then because he had such talent for horse racing, he became incredibly wealthy and famous and was the first sports celebrity. Kids can identify, they can take this story, and by talking about it, suddenly they sort of understand firsthand what it was like to be a slave, what it was like to have been freed but have no opportunities for schooling or work, and then because of partly your talent and partly a lucky break, you get to become uber famous. And then depending on the age group and whether they read the author's note at the end, they also can learn about the Jim Crow era and how all of that reversed and everything that Isaac built was taken away from him. And kids are very sophisticated about that. They understand that, and they often are really good at comparing Isaac to someone now, which always fascinates me. So there's a lot of different things that teachers use it for.
Now, I understand Isaac Murphy had several life threats against him. Can you elaborate on any of these?
Yes, when, and that part's really sad. And again, if I'm with fifth graders, we often talk about this a lot. If I'm with second graders, I don't think they're quite ready for that. I would rather they learn that later. But what happened was that before the Civil War, slaves did all the riding because it was dangerous. So had the Civil War, suddenly they were free. Before the war, they were not paid and they were not named. They rode, the horse got all the credit. After the war, suddenly, if someone wanted, like Isaac Murphy, to ride, they had to pay him and they had to give him credit. So initially, all of the riders in the Kentucky Derby were black because they were people who had been slaves. They weren't slaves. They still had all the smarts about horses. And that was okay for a while until they started earning huge sums of money. And at the time, about 1884, 85, when Isaac reached the peak of his career, was also the same time a lot of poor white Irish people, perhaps some of my relatives, came over. They were desperate for work. They were willing to do anything. Many of them were good with horses. And so what would happen is during a race, and this became very common, not just against Isaac Murphy, but against other people, there might be 4 white riders who would get together and they would draw straws, and whoever got the shortest straw, they would point to him and say, okay, you take out Murphy on the first turn and then one of us will win. And so the goal was to bump his horse just hard enough that he would fall and be severely injured or killed, but that you would stay in the saddle. It was very, very dangerous. And so Isaac had that happen to him, and then he also, because of his own difficulty in keeping his weight down, that also became a threat to his life. So there were many risks.
Well, what parallels do you see in your own life with your book?
Oh, that's interesting. Sometimes when I go to school, someone will ask, and I have a friend who's an African-American school principal, and he takes me around to programs, and he always laughs and says, I'm a middle-aged black man, and this is my friend Patsi Trollinger. She's a middle-aged white woman, and we're going to talk about Isaac Murphy. And I say, James, you really shouldn't introduce me that way. But he laughs and says that it fascinates him that I am a white person from the mountains, but this story fascinated me. And when I explain why, I say that where I grew up, at the time I grew up there, being a female from Tennessee made you an instant underdog. Tennessee at that time ranked very low in literacy, very high in poverty, and if someone met you, they didn't expect much from you. And so I feel strongly about that notion of being an underdog and knowing that you have something else to offer. And so I feel very strongly that his story is about that, being an underdog, but you know you've got something and you want to show what you have.
So what are you working on now?
Oh, let's cross our fingers that I get another book contract. I have about 14 unsold manuscripts, but right now I'm determined, hopefully, to get an agent. And I have 2 middle grade novels. That's, again, fiction for grades like 4, 5, 6. One of them is set. It's the first time I've ever set a fiction story in the mountains, and it's a humorous thing about a boy from the mountains who he would like for people to stop looking at him and thinking he's an overweight hillbilly, because he knows in his heart he is the next great movie star. And he really does have talent. And so there's a lot of humor about, and his nickname is Spud because his favorite food is potatoes. This is something from my childhood. And so Spud Stillerman is out to prove to the world I'm talent. And I actually have an editor who requested it, and it's being considered right now, so we will cross our fingers.
Well, thank you very much for sharing with us today and for being here. We'll be back in just a moment to wrap up Direction Northeast.
Personal, affordable, convenient. That's Northeast State in a nutshell. Find your path to success through our wide variety of programs and nearby locations. Whatever brings you here, Northeast State offers a smart start to a 4-year degree or the choice of several technical programs, giving you direct entry into the workforce. Northeast State Community College. Wherever you're going, we're here to get you there.
That concludes the program for today. We talked with local author Patsi Trollinger about her book, Perfect Timing. Community is very important to the students at Northeast State Community College, and this program takes a look at a few of the subjects they find important. Until we meet next time, and on behalf of the students, staff, and faculty of Northeast State Community College, I'm Laura LaRue, and this is Direction Northeast.